I'll never forget the moment I walked into that restaurant and saw my coworkers' faces drop in absolute shock when I started signing fluently to the woman they'd set me up with as some cruel joke, and what happened next made several of them actually break down crying right there in public. So tell me honestly, was I wrong for turning their mean-spirited prank into something that changed all of our lives forever? Or would you have done exactly what I did if you'd had the chance to show people that kindness and preparation can defeat cruelty every single time? Let me take you back to where this whole incredible story really begins, because it starts about 2 years before that setup dinner, back when I was just Daniel Morrison, a quiet 31-year-old accountant working at a mid-sized firm in Seattle, the kind of guy who kept his head down, did his work, and went home to his empty apartment without making waves or drawing attention to myself. I'd always been that way, ever since I was a kid. The shy one who preferred books to parties, the one who got picked last for teams and ate lunch alone. And that pattern had followed me into adulthood, where I found myself as the office wallflower, the guy everyone was polite to but nobody really knew or cared to know. My coworkers weren't overtly cruel to me, but they definitely saw me as an easy target for their jokes and someone they could safely ignore when it came to after-work drinks or weekend plans. And I'd gotten used to that isolation, even though it hurt more than I ever let on. The real story starts on a Tuesday afternoon about 2 years ago when I was having lunch alone at a park near my office, something I did every day when the weather was decent because it got me away from the forced small talk of the break room. I was sitting on my usual bench eating a sandwich and reading a book when I noticed a young woman at the next bench over who was clearly frustrated, trying to communicate something to a food truck vendor who looked increasingly confused and annoyed. The woman was using sign language, her hands moving rapidly and expressively, but the vendor just kept shaking his head and pointing at the menu with exasperation. I watched this painful exchange for about a minute, watching the woman's frustration mount and the vendor's patience thin, and something inside me just couldn't stand by anymore. I'd taken exactly 1 semester of American Sign Language in college about 10 years earlier, barely remembered anything beyond the alphabet and a few basic phrases, but I stood up and walked over anyway. I approached the vendor and asked what the problem was, and he said the woman was trying to order something, but he couldn't understand what she wanted. I turned to the woman, who looked at me with a mixture of hope and wariness that I'll never forget, and I very slowly, very carefully signed what I hoped was, "Can I help you?" using the few signs I could remember. Her face lit up with such relief and gratitude that it physically hurt my heart, and she signed something back to me that I absolutely did not understand, but I could tell she was trying to order food. Through a combination of pointing, my terrible signing, her patient repetition, and a lot of guesswork, I managed to help her place her order with the vendor, who seemed both relieved and slightly ashamed of his own impatience. The woman, whose name I learned was Sarah, thanked me profusely through signs I mostly didn't understand, but her smile and the warmth in her eyes said everything I needed to know. We sat on the bench together while waiting for her food, and she pulled out her phone and typed a message to me. "Thank you so much for helping. Most people just walk away or get frustrated with me. You're very kind." I typed back that I was sorry I didn't know more sign language and that I wished I could communicate with her better, and she responded with something that would change the entire trajectory of my life. "You could learn. It's never too late, and the deaf community always needs more people who are willing to make the effort to understand us." That simple statement hit me like a lightning bolt, and I thought about my lonely evenings with nothing but Netflix and my cat for company, and I realized I had all the time in the world to learn something meaningful, something that could help me connect with people in a way I'd never been able to before. Sarah and I exchanged phone numbers before parting ways, and she texted me that evening with links to free online ASL courses, local classes, and community groups where I could practice. That very night, I signed up for a beginner ASL course at a community college that started the following week, and I threw myself into learning this beautiful, expressive language with an intensity that surprised even me. For the next year and a half, learning ASL became my entire life outside of work. I took classes 3 evenings a week. I practiced for hours every night in front of my mirror. I watched videos of deaf signers until I could pick up the subtle differences in regional signs and the way facial expressions and body language were integral parts of the grammar. I joined a deaf community center and attended their social events, where patient native signers helped me improve and welcomed me into their world with a warmth I'd never experienced before. I made friends, real friends, for the first time in years. People who didn't care that I was quiet or awkward because we were communicating in a language where being expressive and physical was actually necessary. Sarah became one of my closest friends, meeting me weekly for coffee where we'd practice signing and she'd teach me about deaf culture and the challenges deaf people face in a hearing world. Through her, I met dozens of other deaf individuals, from young children to elderly people, and I fell in love with this vibrant, rich community that I'd never known existed just beneath the surface of the hearing world I'd always inhabited. By the time 18 months had passed, I was functionally fluent in ASL, able to hold complex conversations about everything from politics to philosophy, able to interpret for friends who needed help with hearing people, able to think in ASL rather than just translating from English in my head. But here's the thing, I never told anyone at work about any of this. My coworkers knew nothing about my evenings and weekends, knew nothing about the transformation I was undergoing, because they'd never asked and I'd never volunteered the information. To them, I was still just quiet, boring Daniel from accounting, the guy who had no life and no interesting qualities whatsoever. They'd occasionally make jokes about setting me up on blind dates, teasing me about being perpetually single and socially awkward, and I'd just smile and brush it off because I'd learned a long time ago that defending yourself just makes workplace bullies double down. Then came the incident that led to everything else, a particularly rough week at work where I'd had to pull several all-nighters to fix a major accounting error that wasn't even my fault, and I was exhausted and running on coffee fumes. During a Friday afternoon meeting, my supervisor made a comment about how I had no life anyway, so I might as well take on another project over the weekend, and several of my coworkers laughed like this was the height of comedy. I felt my face burn with humiliation, but I just nodded and said I'd do it, because that's what I always did. After the meeting, I overheard two of my coworkers, Brad and Jennifer, talking in the break room about how pathetic I was and how they should set me up on a date just to watch me crash and burn. I wasn't supposed to hear that conversation, but I did, and it hurt in a way that I'm not sure I can fully express even now. The following Monday, Brad approached my desk with this big, friendly smile that I immediately knew was fake, and he said he had great news for me. He said he had a friend, a really wonderful woman who was single and looking to date, and he thought we'd be perfect for each other. And would I be interested in a blind date? Every instinct I had screamed that this was a trap, that Brad had never shown any interest in my personal well-being before and wasn't about to start now. But I was so lonely and so tired of being the office joke that I heard myself say yes. Brad looked almost surprised that I'd agreed, but he recovered quickly and said he'd set it up for Friday night at a nice restaurant downtown, his treat for the reservation. I should have known something was wrong from how eager he was, how he kept emphasizing that I should definitely show up and that this woman was really special and I should give it my all. The rest of the week I caught Brad and Jennifer and a few others whispering and laughing, and I absolutely knew that I was being set up for some kind of humiliation, but I'd committed to going, and some stubborn part of me refused to back out and give them the satisfaction of calling me a coward. I spent that week preparing like I was going into battle, getting a haircut, buying a new shirt, rehearsing conversation topics in my mind, and trying to steel myself for whatever cruel twist they had planned. Friday night arrived, and I got to the restaurant 15 minutes early, my heart pounding with anxiety and dread. I gave the hostess my name and she led me to a table, saying my party would arrive shortly. I sat there nursing a water and trying to calm my nerves, watching the door and wondering what kind of woman Brad had convinced to participate in this humiliation. Maybe she was in on the joke, maybe she was cruel like they were, or maybe she was another target like me and didn't know she was being used. At exactly 7 o'clock, I saw Brad, Jennifer, and two other coworkers from the office, Mike and Susan, walk into the restaurant and take a table across the room from mine. And my stomach sank, because now I knew for certain this was a setup, and they'd come to watch whatever show they'd orchestrated. A few minutes later, the hostess approached my table leading a woman, and I stood up to greet my date, and the moment I saw her, I understood the cruel joke they'd planned. The woman was beautiful, with long dark hair and kind brown eyes, and she was deaf. I could tell immediately from the way she was using sign language to try to communicate with the hostess, who looked flustered and confused. Brad had set me up with a deaf woman, expecting that I wouldn't be able to communicate with her, that we'd have an awkward, painful dinner where I'd struggle and fail and eventually give up, and he and his friends could laugh at both of us, at me for being so pathetic and at her for being deaf, turning two human beings into entertainment for their cruel amusement. I felt rage boil up inside me, not at this woman who was innocent in all of this, but at my coworkers who thought disability was a punchline, who thought they could humiliate both of us for their own entertainment. The woman reached my table and the hostess gestured to me and then quickly retreated, leaving us standing there looking at each other. And I could see uncertainty and resignation in the woman's eyes, like she'd been through this before, like she was already preparing herself for an uncomfortable evening with someone who couldn't communicate with her. I took a deep breath, smiled, and signed, "Hello, my name is Daniel. It's wonderful to meet you." The transformation in her face was instant and incredible. Her eyes went wide. With shock, her mouth fell open, and then she broke into the most radiant smile I'd ever seen. And she signed back, "I'm Lisa. I cannot believe you know sign language. Brad told me he had a friend who wanted to meet me, but he didn't mention you could sign. This is amazing." We both sat down, and I glanced over at Brad's table across the room and saw all four of them staring at us with expressions of absolute confusion and shock, clearly trying to figure out what was happening because they could see us having an animated conversation using our hands, but they'd expected awkward silence and humiliation. So that's the situation I was in, sitting across from this beautiful woman my coworkers had intended as a cruel joke, and I had the power to communicate with her in ways they never imagined I could, and I had to make a choice about how to handle this evening. Before I tell you what happened next and how this dinner changed everything, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have confronted your coworkers immediately? Would you have just enjoyed your date and ignored them? Would you have left the restaurant? I genuinely want to know, because the choice I made that night set off a chain of events I never could have predicted. I decided in that moment that the best revenge wasn't confrontation, but simply having the best date of my life and letting my coworkers watch their cruel plan backfire spectacularly. Lisa and I spent the next 3 hours talking, laughing, sharing stories about our lives, and discovering that we had an incredible amount in common. She told me she was a graphic designer who'd been deaf since birth, and that he'd been reluctant to agree to this blind date, because Brad had been pushy about it in a way that made her uncomfortable. But she'd finally agreed because her friends kept telling her she needed to put herself out there more. I told her about my journey learning ASL, about Sarah and the Deaf Community Center, and how learning this language had changed my entire life, and she was fascinated and moved that I'd put in all that effort without any personal connection to deafness initially. We talked about books and movies and travel and our families, and I found myself more comfortable and open with her than I'd ever been with anyone. Maybe because communicating in sign language forced me to be expressive and physical in ways that broke through my usual shyness, or maybe because she was just an extraordinary person who made me want to be brave. Throughout the dinner, I was peripherally aware of Brad's table, could see them watching us with increasing confusion and agitation, clearly not understanding how their joke had gone so wrong. About halfway through our meal, I saw Brad get up and start walking toward our table, probably to check on why we seemed to be having such a good time, and I felt Lisa tense up beside me, but I signed to her, "Don't worry, I've got this." Brad approached with a fake smile and said loudly, as if volume would help, "Hey Daniel, just wanted to check how things are going over here." He was talking only to me, completely ignoring Lisa, which made my blood boil, but I kept my voice pleasant as I said, "Things are going wonderfully, Brad. Lisa is amazing. Thank you so much for introducing us. This is honestly the best date I've ever been on." I saw confused ion flicker across his face, and then I turned to Lisa and signed everything I'd just said to Brad, adding, "This man and his friends set us up as a joke because they thought I couldn't communicate with you and we'd both be humiliated. But they didn't know I've been learning ASL for almost 2 years, so the joke is definitely on them." Lisa's eyes went wide, and she looked at Brad with such disdain, and then she signed to me, "Should we give them a show?" I grinned and signed back, "Absolutely." We proceeded to have the most animated, expressive signed conversation full of laughter and dramatic gestures, and I could see Brad standing there completely at a loss, unable to understand what we were saying, unable to figure out if we were talking about him or just ignoring him entirely. Finally, he retreated to his table in confusion, and Lisa and I tried to contain our laughter. We finished our dinner, ordered dessert, and talked for another hour, and by the end of the evening I knew I wanted to see her again, and she felt the same way. When the check came, I paid for our meal, and as we were getting ready to leave, I told Lisa I needed to do something, and asked if she'd wait for me. She nodded, curious, and I walked over to Brad's table where all 4 of my coworkers were sitting looking bewildered and annoyed that their entertainment for the evening hadn't panned out the way they'd planned. I stood at their table and said in a clear, calm voice, "I want to thank you all for tonight. You set me up with Lisa intending to humiliate us both, using her deafness as a punchline for your cruel joke, and instead you introduced me to the most incredible woman I've met in years. We had an amazing evening. We're going out again next weekend, and I genuinely hope you all feel terrible about yourselves for being the kind of people who would mock someone's disability for your own entertainment." I saw Jennifer's face crumble and tears start forming in her eyes. Saw Mike look down at the table in shame. Saw Susan put her hand over her mouth in horror at what they'd done, and even Brad had the decency to look uncomfortable. But I wasn't done. I continued, "Lisa is a brilliant, talented, kind person who happens to be deaf, and if you'd bothered to see her as a human being instead of a prop for your joke, you might have realized that. And I'm not the pathetic loser you all think I am for the past 2 years while you've been making fun of me and treating me like I'm invisible. I've been part of an amazing community. I've learned a beautiful language. I've made real friends, and I've built a life that's richer and more meaningful than anything happening in this office. So thank you for tonight, sincerely, because you've given me something wonderful while revealing exactly who you all are." I turned and walked back to Lisa, who'd been watching this whole exchange and could read the emotions on everyone's faces even if she couldn't hear the words, and I signed to her, "Ready to get out of here?" She took my arm and we walked out of that restaurant together, leaving my coworkers sitting in stunned silence at their table. In the parking lot, Lisa stopped and turned to me and signed, "That was incredibly brave, and I'm so sorry you had to work with people like that. But I'm glad they brought us together, even if their intentions were terrible." I signed back, "I'm glad too. Would you like to go get coffee somewhere else and continue this conversation?" She smiled and nodded, and we spent another 3 hours at a 24-hour diner, talking until the early morning hours, and by the time I drove her home and walked her to her door, I was completely smitten. The following Monday at work was intense. I arrived at my usual time to find Jennifer waiting at my desk with red, puffy eyes, and she immediately started apologizing, saying she'd spent the entire weekend thinking about what they'd done and feeling horrible about it, that she'd never really thought about how cruel their jokes were until I called them out so directly, and she was genuinely sorry. Over the course of the day, Mike and Susan also came by to apologize, both looking genuinely remorseful, and even Brad, who I could tell it killed to admit he was wrong, came by and mumbled an apology. I accepted their apologies because I'm not a person who holds grudges, but I also made it clear that things needed to change, and to their credit, they did change. My coworkers started actually talking to me like a person, asking about my weekend, including me in lunch plans, and when I mentioned I was dating someone, they seemed genuinely happy for me. I started bringing Lisa around to office events, and I watched my coworkers learn to communicate with her through me interpreting, and several of them even asked me to teach them basic signs. Jennifer actually enrolled in an ASL class at the community college after meeting Lisa, saying she wanted to be able to communicate with deaf customers who came into her part-time, retail job. Lisa and I continued dating, and our relationship deepened into something really beautiful and real. She introduced me to her family and her deaf friends, and I introduced her to Sarah and my friends from the deaf community, and our 2 worlds merged seamlessly. About a year after that first dinner, I proposed to her at the Deaf Community Center where I'd spent so many hours learning and practicing, surrounded by the people who'd helped me become the person I was, and she said yes. We got married 6 months later in a ceremony that was fully accessible to both deaf and hearing guests, with interpreters for the hearing people, and captions on screens, and the entire ceremony done in both English and ASL. Brad, Jennifer, Mike, and Susan all came to the wedding, and Jennifer gave a speech where she talked about how meeting Lisa and watching our relationship had opened her eyes to her own prejudices and changed her for the better. It was a surprisingly moving moment, and evidence that people can grow and change when confronted with their own cruelty. Now, 3 years after that setup dinner, Lisa and I have a life that's more wonderful than I ever imagined possible. We have a beautiful home. We're part of a tight-knit community of both deaf and hearing friends, and we're expecting our first child in a few months. I still work at the same company, but my relationship with my coworkers has completely transformed, and I'm no longer the invisible joke but someone they respect and value. Lisa runs her own successful graphic design business and does advocacy work for deaf rights in her spare time. We often talk about that first dinner and how a cruel joke intended to humiliate us ended up being the best thing that ever happened to both of us, and how my decision to learn ASL 2 years earlier had positioned me perfectly for that moment. If I hadn't helped Sarah at that food truck, if I hadn't taken her suggestion to learn sign language seriously, if I hadn't spent hundreds of hours studying and practicing, that dinner would have gone exactly the way Brad planned. 2 people sitting in awkward silence, both humiliated, both hurt. Instead, it became the beginning of the greatest love story of my life. The moral of this story, if there is one, is that kindness and preparation can turn cruelty on its head, and that the best revenge is living well and proving your detractors wrong in the most spectacular way possible. It's about how learning to communicate with people who are different from you opens up entire worlds you never knew existed. It's about how what seems like a cruel joke can become a beautiful gift if you're ready to receive it. And it's about how the quiet, unnoticed work we do on ourselves in private can prepare us for moments that change our lives forever. Like this video if you were on my side and think I handled that situation the right way. Subscribe for more stories about turning cruel jokes into beautiful victories and about the unexpected ways our lives can change when we choose kindness and growth over bitterness. And share your final thoughts in the comments about what you would have done differently, whether you think my coworkers deserve forgiveness, and what this story means to you. I'll see you all in the next story.